October 23rd, 1987, Arlington, Texas. 43-year-old Patsy Wright phones up her sister in the middle of the night to complain that she has become nauseous after taking some NyQuil, but collapses during the call. Even when her sister and brother-in-law rush over to help her, Patsy dies in her bed, and an autopsy reveals that she was poisoned after strychnine was put in her NyQuil. Evidence suggests that someone else may have had dinner at Patsy's house on the night of her death, but this person was never identified, and Patsy's killer and the motive for her poisoning remain unknown. After that, the trail went cold. Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to the first Trail Went Cold episode of 2017. I am your host, Robin Warder, and I can tell you that this is going to be a very exciting and memorable year for our podcast. So I've decided to start off 2017 with a mystery which has been requested by a lot of people from the Unsolved Mysteries message board I frequent at the Sitcoms Online forum, the 1987 poisoning death of Patsy Wright. This case has been requested from the board's moderator, who goes by the username LooksLikeCRicci, and a couple of other posters there who go by the usernames Dallas Texan and 88 Keys. And in case you haven't heard the news, classic episodes of Unsolved Mysteries are finally going to be available for streaming for the first time ever this year. So what better way to start off 2017 than with a classic Unsolved Mysteries case? The death of Patsy Wright is also notable in that it's the first poisoning case I've ever featured on this podcast, as the poor woman died after taking some NyQuil laced with strychnine. This story was originally featured on Unsolved Mysteries in April of 1989, but other than an extensive article which was published around the same time in the Dallas-based D magazine, there really isn't a whole lot of info about this case online. But this mystery definitely deserves another look, because there are really only a handful of suspects who could have committed this crime, and whoever was responsible has gotten away with it for nearly 30 years. However, before we get started, let me get my first business spiel of 2017 out of the way. The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes and 15 to 20-minute minisodes. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new minisode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who's feeling generous and wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout out on a future episode. We've had quite a few new donors this past week, named Timothy, Michelle, and Carrie, so thank you very much, guys. And since we've entered a new month and a new year, I need to provide a shout out to our listeners who have signed up for regular monthly donations. And they are Alice, Amber, Dawn, and Casey. Thanks, guys. You are so awesome. And just a reminder that you do have the option to sign up for regular donations every month, or if you prefer, just make a one-time only donation. We're quite happy either way. So let's now start off the new year by examining the mysterious poisoning of Patsy Wright. Our story begins in 1987 in Arlington, Texas. Our central figure is a successful 43-year-old businesswoman named Patsy Bolton Wright. Patsy and her sister, Sally Bolton Horning, co-own a pair of popular wax museums in the area, which they inherited from their father, and are worth a combined total of $6 million. Patsy has been divorced twice, and has 2 children from her first husband, a son named Wayne, and a daughter named Leslie. At this point, she is living in a temporary rental house because she is planning to purchase a ranch, where she can raise and train 3 horses that she owns. At around 3 a.m. on October 23rd, Sally Horning and her husband Steve were awakened by a frantic phone call from Patsy, who claimed that she had just taken some NyQuil to help her sleep, but was now feeling very nauseous and having trouble breathing. In the middle of the call, Patsy suddenly collapsed. Sally attempted to call the police, but since she did not remember the exact address of Patsy's rental home, they could not send any assistance there. So Sally and Steve were forced to drive over to Patsy's house to check on her themselves. The front door was locked, but Steve noticed that Patsy's bedroom window was partially open and was able to enter through there. Steve and Sally found Patsy on her bed and thought she might have just fainted, but they could not wake her up. While Sally phoned for help, Steve attempted to perform mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on Patsy, but was surprised when green liquid kept entering his mouth, which he subsequently spit out onto the bed. Paramedics soon arrived, and even though they made an attempt to revive Patsy, they were unsuccessful and she was declared dead after arriving at the hospital. Patsy's family were shocked and absolutely devastated by this, since she was a very healthy person, but they did not initially suspect foul play. However, over a week after Patsy's death, a routine autopsy was performed and a shocking discovery was made. There were traces of strychnine in Patsy's bloodstream, meaning that she had been poisoned. Now, if you're familiar with strychnine, that's probably because it happens to be a very popular method of death in fiction. If you've ever read a murder mystery or watched a movie in which a character is poisoned, strychnine is often used. That's probably because it causes convulsions and a very violent reaction from the victim, which makes for a very dramatic death scene. However, real-life cases of strychnine poisoning are actually quite rare, probably because strychnine isn't exactly a common household item and not particularly easy for the average person to obtain. There are a few notable people who have died from strychnine poisoning, such as Jane Stanford, one of the co-founders of Stanford University, and a few serial killers from the late 1800s, early 1900s used it as their primary method of murder. However, you never hear about cases of strychnine poisoning today. At the time of Patsy Wright's death, there had only been one other confirmed case of strychnine poisoning within the past 4 decades. There are very few outlets where you can purchase strychnine, and all those sales are strictly regulated by the government. So if you were to purchase it and use it to poison someone, chances are that it would be traced back to you. It is also considered to be one of the most sadistic forms of poisoning, as the victim does not die a quick death. So whatever the motive was for Patsy's murder, the perpetrator probably wanted her to suffer before she passed away. Given that Patsy had mentioned taking NyQuil right before phoning her sister, it seemed likely that this was the source of the poisoning, and sure enough, huge traces of strychnine were found in a NyQuil bottle from her bathroom. Technically, a few grams of strychnine are enough to be fatal, but there was enough in there to kill 8 or 9 people. Investigators did look into the possibility of suicide, but since Patsy was very wealthy and successful and had a great relationship with her 2 children, this seemed completely unlikely. Patsy's alarm clock was also set to go off hours after she died, and it's doubtful someone would do that if they were planning on taking their own life. And besides, poisoning yourself with strychnine is an odd method of suicide, as you would most definitely not experience a quick, painless death. Police also checked to see if her death might have been the result of product tampering. Remember, this was only a few years removed from the infamous Chicago Tylenol murders case, in which a still unidentified perpetrator opened some random Tylenol bottles on store shelves, laced some capsules with potassium cyanide, and wound up causing the deaths of 7 people when this Tylenol was subsequently purchased. But this possibility was eventually ruled out, and Patsy's death was determined to be murder. And it was apparent the murder was likely committed by someone Patsy knew. It was Patsy's habit to frequently take nighttime cold medicine whenever she had trouble sleeping, so obviously, anyone who laced her NyQuil with strychnine had to be aware of this routine. Of course, Patsy's penchant for taking NyQuil was well known among her family and friends, so there were more than a few suspects. However, 2 empty dinner plates were found on the tray next to Patsy's bed, which seemed to indicate that someone else had been with her that night. The house's burglar alarm was not set, something Patsy might have forgotten to do if she was not spending the night alone. There was also nothing missing from the house, so it didn't appear that any burglary took place. Patsy's boyfriend at the time was a man named Larry Todd, but he was at his home in Austin 3 hours away on the night of the murder. Phone records showed that he made a call to Patsy's house and spoke with her that night, so there was no way he could have been there and committed the crime. However, there are a number of other suspects who would have potential motive to murder Patsy. Her 2 children, Wayne and Leslie, were set to inherit her sizable estate, but by all accounts they had a great relationship with their mother and both of them passed polygraph tests. But here's an odd development. Shortly after her mother's death, Leslie claimed she received a phone call from an anonymous woman who asked for Patsy. When Leslie informed her that Patsy had died, this woman said, "Good, I wanted her dead." This caller was never identified, and whether this was just a prank or the woman was directly involved in the murder is unknown. Now, Sally and Steve Horning, they stood to inherit both of the multi-million-dollar wax museums after Patsy's death. Sally and Patsy had entered a buy-sell agreement and had $500,000 life insurance policies on each other. If either of them died, the surviving sister would use the life insurance money to buy out the other's share of stock and become sole owner of the museums. Patsy and Sally were always on good terms, but the problem was that Patsy had a pretty contentious relationship with her brother-in-law, who was not known for being financially responsible. Within a few years after they got married, Steve had spent most of Sally's inheritance from her father and gone into debt. And a complication arose in 1985 when Sally was diagnosed with cancer. If Sally died, Steve would receive the $500,000 life insurance policy and could then wind up owning the controlling share of the stock in the museums if something ever happened to Patsy. Sally's cancer had gone into remission in the summer of 1987, but Patsy did not want to risk the possibility of Steve ever having control of the museums, given his less than stellar financial history. So both sisters agreed that their buy-sell agreement needed to be changed, and they scheduled a meeting for this in early November. However, Patsy died only 2 weeks before this meeting was to take place. Obviously, Sally, and particularly Steve, had a motive to murder Patsy, but they both agreed to take polygraphs. Sally passed, and while the results of Steve's first polygraph test were inconclusive, he did end up passing the second one. The one detail which made investigators lean towards Steve's innocence was the fact that he performed mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on Patsy when he found her, which seems like a pretty risky thing to do when you know that poison liquid is going to come out of the victim's mouth. And there's also the fact that the strychnine-laced NyQuil bottle was left on Patsy's bathroom counter for the police to find. Sally and Steve arrived at the house long before the police did, so if they were responsible, why not use this opportunity to get rid of the bottle, or dump out the rest of the NyQuil in order to cover their tracks? Before she became involved with Larry Todd, the last person to have dated Patsy was a man named Leo Fikes. The relationship came to an end because Leo wanted to get married, but after 2 previous divorces, Patsy had no desire to ever get married again. Leo cooperated with the authorities and also passed a polygraph, so he was never considered a serious suspect. So what about Patsy's 2 ex-husbands? Well, her first marriage was to Bill Wright, the father of her 2 children. They divorced in 1980, but by all accounts the divorce was pretty amicable, and Patsy even retained her ex-husband's last name. Like Leo Fikes, Bill fully cooperated with the investigation and passed a polygraph. But Patsy's second ex-husband, Bob Cox, that's a different story. Patsy and Bob first got together while he was separated from his first wife, and even though she felt the guy was charming at first, he turned into an altogether different person after they got married. Bob became verbally abusive towards Patsy and pretty much lived off her money. He also had a severe gambling problem, and when it got to the point where the IRS planned to seize Patsy's assets to pay off Bob's tax debts, that was pretty much the end of the line. The couple got divorced in 1984 after only being married for a year. Patsy was then forced to obtain a restraining order against Bob because he was following and harassing her, and she saw him parked outside her house on numerous occasions. Things finally settled down, but Bob eventually re-entered Patsy's life again when she was deposed to testify in a civil trial. Like Patsy, Bob ran his own wax museum until it was destroyed in a fire. However, since the wax museum wasn't particularly successful, and Bob was in financial trouble at the time, the insurance company believed that he started the fire himself. They refused to pay out Bob's claim, so he filed suit against them. Patsy had some pretty incriminating information about financial misdeeds Bob had committed during their marriage, and her testimony would likely be beneficial to the insurance company's case. Bob contacted Patsy on several occasions to convince her to lie in her testimony, which she refused to do. Of course, Patsy never did testify, as her death took place only 10 days before the civil trial began. Unlike the other suspects in this case, Bob Cox refused to take a polygraph test. He did not participate in the Unsolved Mystery segment or speak to the media. In the end, Bob Cox did win his civil trial and was awarded $1.3 million, as it could not be conclusively proven that he started the fire. Well, believe it or not, one of Patsy's wax museums also burned down nearly a year after her death, and Sally received a $4 million insurance payout. And in a bizarre turn of events, a man named Stanley Lester Pointer was arrested for trying to steal a ledger book from the ashes of the museum 2 weeks after the fire. Pointer had one previous arrest on his record for arson and was considered a possible suspect in the wax museum fire, but nothing could be proven, and he was released due to lack of evidence. He was also looked at as a possible suspect in Patsy's death, but when Dallas police made an attempt to arrest him for re-questioning in 1991, Pointer tried to flee, and since he nearly ran over a police officer in the process, they opened fire on Pointer and killed him. But that's not all. When the Wax Museum fire made the news in 1988, a woman recently released from jail got in touch with police and provided some interesting information. In 1984, a 26-year-old receptionist at the Wax Museum named Lori Ann Williams suddenly doubled over in pain one day and was taken to the hospital. She died 11 days later, and her cause of death was never determined. This woman claimed she had a husband whom she feared was attempting to poison her, and she wondered if Lori Ann Williams might have also been a victim of strychnine poisoning. Williams' body was exhumed to see if she had been poisoned, but the results were inconclusive. It doesn't look like this lead ever went anywhere, and I don't know anything about the identity of this female informant or her husband, who was allegedly trying to poison her. After the Unsolved Mysteries segment aired, and the article ran in D Magazine, it looks like the case came to a complete standstill, and there haven't been any major new developments in the past 3 decades. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So out of all the cases I've covered on this podcast, this is the one that most resembles an Agatha Christie mystery. You have a victim who was killed by a very dramatic method, strychnine poisoning, and several different suspects who each have their own motive for committing the murder. It is surprising that no one was able to track down who purchased the strychnine, given how closely its sales are regulated, but I think it's likely that it was obtained through illegal means. It could have been purchased on the black market, and since strychnine is sometimes used in chemistry labs, it might have been stolen from somewhere. So I guess the only thing we can do is look at the suspects and determine the likelihood of any of them being responsible for the murder. A lot of them, such as Patsy's children, her first ex-husband Bill Wright, and her ex-boyfriend Leo Fikes, they seem pretty unlikely. And the ones with the strongest motives for committing the crime are her sister and brother-in-law, Sally and Steve Horning, and her second ex-husband, Bob Cox. Let's start with Sally and Steve. One thing I'm not entirely sure about is whether Sally Horning is still alive today. She was battling cancer during the 80s, and even though she was in remission at the time of Patsy's death, there was fear that it might return, since both of their parents and 2 of their grandparents had died of cancer. There is an entry at Find a Grave for Patsy Wright, and it also contains links for the graves of her parents and her first husband, Bill Wright, who passed away in 2005. But there is no link to a grave for Sally, so I have to assume she successfully beat cancer and is still alive. I just can't reconcile the notion that someone would plan to murder their own sister after battling cancer for 2 years. Sally stood to profit from Patsy's death, but what would be the point if the cancer returned and she wasn't around to enjoy the profits? As far as I know, Sally and Steve did not have any children. So this wouldn't be a Walter White Breaking Bad type situation in which a cancer-stricken person commits murder in order to ensure they leave a lot of money behind for their family. If Sally died, the only person who would benefit and inherit all of her fortune would be Steve, a man with a history of being financially irresponsible with money. So I really have my doubts that Sally played any role in her sister's death. But could Steve have orchestrated Patsy's death without Sally's knowledge? Well, the one thing which has always worked in Steve's favor is the fact that he attempted to perform CPR on Patsy, which could have potentially caused some poison liquid to enter his own mouth. Now, you may be wondering how police could even be certain that Steve performed CPR, but during Sally's phone call with the emergency operator, she could be heard giving Steve instructions like, "You have to blow into her mouth." However, when the paramedics arrived and performed CPR on Patsy themselves, they said that she immediately regurgitated large amounts of liquid which were much less than Steve claimed. So could this mean that Steve and Sally were lying about performing CPR and just putting on a show for the emergency operator? Or could it be that since he was not an experienced medical professional, Steve just didn't perform the CPR properly? Here's one detail some people might find strange. Remember how when Patsy collapsed in the middle of the phone call and Sally attempted to call the police, but did not remember the exact address of Patsy's rental house? Yet even though Sally didn't remember the address, she and Steve were able to drive over there themselves before they attempted to call for help again. That might sound suspicious, but I can actually identify with their situation. It doesn't seem unbelievable to me that Sally and Steve might have known the route to Patsy's house, but didn't know the exact address. That often happens to me. I will sometimes know the exact location of a certain place in my head and know how to get there, but if you ask me to name the exact address, I'd probably draw a complete blank. And besides, if Sally and Steve wanted to go over to Patsy's house before the police arrived, you'd think they would have used this opportunity to dispose of evidence, such as the NyQuil bottle. In fact, why even plant the seed by telling the police that Patsy had mentioned taking NyQuil during her phone call? If either Steve or Sally poisoned Patsy, then it should have been so easy for them to ensure that no one ever figured out how it happened. So I'm inclined to believe that neither of them are involved. The biggest wild card is the tray with the 2 dinner plates found in Patsy's bedroom. And here's one detail I'm very confused about. Steve claimed that he moved aside these plates when he attempted to perform CPR on Patsy. In the D Magazine article, it stated that none of the paramedics or firemen who arrived at the scene remembered seeing the plates. However, the Unsolved Mysteries segment never gives any indication that those plates weren't there. But even if the medics or firemen didn't see the plates, surely the police verified their existence and collected them as evidence. Because if Steve mentioned those plates and no one ever found them, then that looks awfully suspicious for him. So maybe there was just some sloppy reporting here from one side, but I have to believe those plates actually existed. If they did, then I have to assume that the police checked them for fingerprints, but didn't find anything incriminating. Those 2 plates are the most important detail in this whole case because they seem to indicate that Patsy was having an intimate dinner in her bedroom with someone else that night. And that is the biggest piece of evidence which points away from her second ex-husband, Bob Cox, and the rest of Patsy's exes for that matter. I know it's not impossible for divorced couples to reconcile, but given their troubled history, there's zero chance that Patsy and Bob would have been sharing an intimate evening together in their bedroom. It was conclusively established that Patsy's current boyfriend, Larry Todd, was 3 hours away in Austin that night. So did this mean that Patsy had a secret lover? Well, if she did, this person has never come forward, which might indicate that they were responsible for putting the strychnine in Patsy's NyQuil. But of course, there's always the possibility that the plates are nothing more than a giant red herring, and that Patsy had dinner in her bedroom alone, and just decided to put her food on 2 separate plates. This is the biggest unanswered questioning in determining whether or not Bob Cox was responsible for her murder. On paper, he is definitely the best suspect. Bob had gone through a nasty divorce with Patsy, she once filed a restraining order against him, and now she was going to provide potentially incriminating testimony against him in a civil trial which was set to start only 10 days later. However, I can't completely discount the possibility that Patsy had a secret lover. In the comments section of Patsy Wright's profile page at the Unsolved Mysteries website, there is a poster named James Ferguson, who mentions that Patsy was having a secret affair with a horse trainer who was involved in the purchase of her horses and was probably responsible for her death. At the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum, a commenter under the username Corvair shared a similar story, claiming that Patsy was having an affair with a worker at a horse ranch who often used strychnine to poison rats. And apparently, this person also knew Lori Ann Williams, and left town shortly after Patsy's death. The poster did not remember this man's name, but given the similarities between these 2 posts, I would not be surprised if James Ferguson and Corvair are the same person. Now, given that these are internet comments, I have no idea if any of this stuff is true. But it should be mentioned that investigators looked at a couple named Bill and Bonnie Alexander, a pair of horse trainers who sold Patsy her horses, and were boarding them for her until she moved to her new ranch. There were rumors that Bill was flirtatious with Patsy, and horse breeders do sometimes use strychnine to treat their animals, but both of the Alexanders passed polygraph tests, and there's no evidence to suggest they were involved. However, given the information provided in those comments, could Patsy have encountered someone who worked for the Alexanders and started an affair with him? I'm not sure, but Patsy already had a boyfriend, so if she did have a secret lover, then I'm not surprised that hardly anyone else would have known about it. All that being said, I can't discount the possibility that Bob Cox orchestrated the murder and hired someone else to carry it out. If the strychnine was acquired on the black market, then it's not unbelievable that Bob could have found someone who was willing to put poison in Patsy's cold medicine. Since he was her ex-husband, Bob certainly would have known about Patsy's habit of taking NyQuil whenever she had trouble sleeping. Bob might have hired someone to pretend to be Patsy's lover so that he'd have access to her house, or this person could have simply broken in to poison the NyQuil. Here's another interesting detail. Patsy had a spare key to her home, but told her sister that it went missing shortly before her death. The spare key was never found, so theoretically, anyone could have stolen it and used it to access her house at any time. If this person locked the door behind them, then no one would have known they were there. And there's also the fact that Patsy's bedroom window was found open on the night of her death, so maybe someone sneaked in that way and poisoned the NyQuil. However, there's another weird intangible that complicates this case, and that's the death of Lori-Ann Williams in 1984. While it was never conclusively established that Williams was poisoned, it's quite a weird coincidence that another healthy young woman who happened to work for Patsy would die under such strange, similar circumstances. But if the two deaths are connected, what motive would Bob Cox have to poison Lori-Ann Williams? And what's the deal with this Stanley Lester Pointer guy, who was caught trying to steal a ledger when Patsy's wax museum burned down and was the prime suspect in the arson? Could Pointer have been connected to the arson at Bob Cox's museum? And what would cause Pointer to nearly run over a police officer and get himself shot and killed when they tried to question him? I have no idea if any of the stuff involving Williams or Pointer is connected to Patsy's death, but it just adds extra complications to this case. So in the end, I'd say I'm probably 60-40 on the culprit being Bob Cox or an unknown secret lover of Patsy's whom we don't even know about. If you're an Occam's razor type of person, Bob Cox is definitely the most logical suspect, and had every motive in the world to commit this murder. But the detail about the dinner plates and the suspicious nature of Lori-Ann Williams' death, it prevents me from going 100% on Cox, and makes me wonder if there's something else going on. If, by chance, this was the work of a serial murderer who used the strychnine to poison both Lori-Ann Williams and Patsy Wright, then that person is an incredibly twisted individual who wanted his victims to die in the most agonizing way possible, and it would not surprise me if they murdered other people. I guess the best case scenario is that the killer was Stanley Lester Pointer, because he was killed a few years later, and is no longer around to harm anyone else. So that brings an end to our first poisoning case on The Trail Went Cold, and even after looking at this mystery from top to bottom, I'm still left scratching my head about who was responsible. So if you think you know who the murderer of Patsy Wright was, or you have any important information pertaining to this case, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own theory about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. I want to thank all my loyal listeners and supporters out there, especially those from the aforementioned Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum, who really wanted me to cover this story, and of course the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thank you to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music, because that will help us garner more exposure and attract potential new listeners. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So thanks for listening to our very first episode of 2017. We're going to be reaching our 1-year anniversary next month, and I can tell you that 2017 will be a very special year for this podcast. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new mini-sode of The Trail Went Cold.